In July 1969, two countries went to war over 3 football matches. Not metaphorically, not as a political crisis that football triggered. A real war. Artillery, airstrikes, infantry crossing borders, 6,000 people dead in 4 days. That began because Honduras and El Salvador could not agree on who deserved to qualify for the 1970 World Cup. The conflict lasted 100 hours. It is called the Football War. The football was never really about football. El Salvador in 1969 was one of the most densely populated countries in Latin America. A small nation with a large and desperately poor rural population and almost no land left to distribute. For decades, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans had crossed the border into Honduras, which was larger, less populated, and had land available for farming. By 1969, approximately 300,000 Salvadorans were living in Honduras. Illegal immigrants by legal definition, but economically essential to the Honduran agricultural economy that had quietly depended on their labor for a generation. Then Honduras changed its land reform laws. The new agrarian reform prioritized Honduran citizens. Salvadoran migrants who had farmed the same land for years were suddenly being evicted. Some were deported, some were attacked. Stories of violence against Salvadoran migrants in Honduras began circulating in El Salvador. Some documented, some exaggerated, some fabricated entirely. And the temperature between the two countries rose to a level that needed only a single spark. The spark was as a football match. The 1970 World Cup qualifying rounds assigned El Salvador and Honduras to the same group. 3 matches, home and away, and a playoff if needed. The first match was played in Tegucigalpa, the Honduran capital, on June 8, 1969. The Salvadoran team was housed in a hotel where Honduran fans gathered outside through the night, honking horns, throwing rocks at windows, making sleep impossible. Standard psychological warfare of the era, practiced by fans across Latin America without anyone declaring war over it. Honduras won 1-0. The second match was played in San Salvador on June 15th. This time, the Honduran team received the same treatment. Sleepless night, hostile crowd, full psychological pressure. Before the match, the Honduran national anthem was played while a dirty rag was raised in place of the Honduran flag. El Salvador won 3-0. A Salvadoran girl named Emilia Bolaños watched the final Honduran goal on television, walked to her father's desk, took out a pistol, and shot herself in the heart. She was 18 years old. The Salvadoran newspapers called her a patriot who could not bear to see her country defeated. She was given a state funeral. The Salvadoran national team walked behind her coffin. The third match, the playoff, was played on neutral ground in Mexico City on June 27th. El Salvador won 3-2 in extra time. Within 2 weeks, both countries had severed diplomatic relations. Within 3 weeks, El Salvador had invaded Honduras. The invasion began at 10 p.m. on July 14th, 1969. Salvadoran forces crossed the border into Honduras on 3 fronts simultaneously. The Salvadoran Air Force, flying propeller-driven aircraft that were obsolete by the standards of the era, attacked Honduran military targets and fuel depots. Salvadoran infantry advanced into Honduran territory behind artillery that had been moved to the border in the weeks of diplomatic deterioration that nobody in the international community had taken seriously enough to stop. The war that diplomats had dismissed as impossible was happening. The Honduran military was caught partially unprepared, but responded faster than El Salvador had anticipated. The Honduran Air Force, equally antiquated, flying the same generation of propeller aircraft as its opponent, struck back at Salvadoran fuel supplies. Both air forces were so small and so limited that the aerial campaign consumed most of their available aircraft within the first 48 hours. Military historians who have studied the football war note something extraordinary about the air combat. Both sides were flying aircraft that had been retired from the United States military in the 1940s. Some of the planes that fought in the only jet-free air war of the 1960s had participated in the Second World War. The pilots who flew them were doing so with navigation equipment that predated the Korean War. It was the last propeller-driven air war in the Western Hemisphere. On the ground, Salvadoran forces made significant early advances. El Salvador was smaller, but had a better trained and better equipped army relative to its size. Honduran forces fell back in the initial days of the invasion. Salvadoran troops captured the Honduran town of Nueva Ocotepeque. The road to the Honduran interior appeared open. Then the Salvadoran army stopped. Not because of Honduran military resistance, though that was stiffening, because El Salvador had run out of fuel. The Honduran airstrikes on Salvadoran fuel depots in the opening hours of the war had been more effective than anyone had realized at the time. The Salvadoran military, which had planned a rapid advance, found itself with armor and vehicles it could not move, and aircraft it could not fly. The offensive that had begun with such momentum simply ran out of the energy it needed to continue. 100 hours after the invasion began, the Organization of American States, which had been issuing increasingly urgent demands for a ceasefire since the first night, finally achieved one. El Salvador withdrew from Honduran territory under significant diplomatic pressure, most notably from the United States, which made clear that continued occupation would have consequences for the economic relationships both countries depended on. The war ended. The border was not formally demarcated for another 11 years. The human cost was precise and devastating in the way that short wars produce. Approximately 6,000 people died. The majority of them were civilians, Salvadoran migrants in Honduras killed in the violence that accompanied and followed the invasion. Honduran civilians caught in the fighting along the border, people on both sides of a conflict that lasted less than a week, but left wounds that took a generation to heal. 300,000 Salvadoran migrants were expelled from Honduras in the months that followed the ceasefire. People who had lived in Honduras for years, who had built homes, raised children, established farms, were forced back into a country that was already too crowded to absorb them. The economic consequences in El Salvador were severe and lasting. The returning migrants competed for land and work that did not exist in sufficient quantity. The social pressure that had driven the original migration had not been resolved by the war. It had been compressed back into the country that could least afford to contain it. 12 years later, El Salvador descended into civil war. The conflict that killed 75,000 people between 1979 and 1992 had many causes. But the demographic pressure that the football war had amplified, the landless, rural poor with nowhere to go and nothing to lose, was among the most important. The football war did not cause the Salvadoran Civil War, but it removed the pressure valve that had allowed El Salvador to export its most desperate people across a border that was now closed. The journalist who named it the Football War was Ryszard Kapuscinski, a Polish foreign correspondent who happened to be in Central America covering the qualifying matches for a Warsaw newspaper. Kapuscinski wrote a dispatch that circulated internationally and gave the conflict the name that stuck. His account, vivid, immediate, written by someone who watched the diplomatic deterioration in real time, was later expanded into a book that became one of the most read accounts of the conflict in the Western world. He was honest about the name's limitations. Football was the trigger. It was not the cause. The cause was land, poverty, migration, and the specific cruelty of a border that divided two countries whose problems were too large for either of them to solve within their own territory. The football matches were simply the moment when the accumulated pressure found its outlet. The story of the football war reveals something about how conflicts actually begin that is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who wants wars to have rational causes. Wars do not require rational causes. They require a situation in which the existing tensions are high enough that any available trigger will do. If the qualifying matches had not provided the trigger in June 1969, something else would have provided it within months. The Honduran land reform that was expelling Salvadoran migrants had been generating violent incidents along the border for years. Diplomatic relations were already deteriorating before the first ball was kicked. The football was the match. The powder was already there. This is why the football war is not actually a story about football. It is a story about what happens when two governments cannot solve the problems that their populations are living inside, and find, in an external conflict, a temporary release for pressures that the conflict does nothing to address. Both governments use the war exactly this way. In El Salvador, the invasion of Honduras united a population that had been deeply divided along class lines, rich and poor, landowning and landless, behind a national cause that made those divisions temporarily invisible. The military government that ordered the invasion was not popular before the war. It was briefly popular during it. In Honduras, the expulsion of Salvadoran migrants satisfied a domestic political demand that had been building for years. The land reform that triggered the crisis had been designed partly to redirect rural anger away from the Honduran government and toward the foreign migrants who were competing for the same resources. Both governments were managing domestic crises with foreign policy. The 6,000 people who died were the cost of that management. Subscribe for more fascinating stories. El Salvador qualified for the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. They were drawn into a group with the Soviet Union, Mexico, and Belgium. They lost all three matches, 0-2 to Belgium, 0-4 to Mexico, 0-2 to the Soviet Union, and went home in the group stage without scoring a single goal. The war that had been fought partly over the right to represent Central America and Mexico produced a team that did not score in 3 games. Honduras did not qualify. The 1970 World Cup proceeded without the football war resolving anything it had been fought over. The border remained disputed. The migrants remained expelled. The land pressure in El Salvador remained unresolved. The military government that had ordered the invasion remained in power, briefly more popular, eventually overthrown. The football that had triggered the war continued being played. In 1980, El Salvador and Honduras met again in World Cup qualifying. The match was played without incident. The war had been over for 11 years. The border had been formally demarcated in 1980, the same year, after negotiations that took a decade longer than the war itself. Football had started it. Football outlasted it. The most extraordinary detail of the football war is the one that gets lost in the larger story. The girl who shot herself. Amelia Bolaños was 18 years old. She watched Honduras score against El Salvador on television and decided that this was a wound she could not survive. She was given a state funeral. The national team walked behind her coffin. The Salvadoran president stood at her grave. A government that was about to send its army across an international border and get 6,000 people killed chose to begin the story of that war with a teenage girl who died because of a football goal. The propaganda value was obvious, but underneath the propaganda was something real. That in El Salvador in 1969, the accumulated humiliation of poverty and displacement and the specific indignity of the treatment of Salvadoran migrants in Honduras had created a population that was genuinely ready to feel that a football loss was a mortal wound. That readiness was not manufactured by the government. It was the authentic expression of people who had been living inside a crisis for so long that they had no way to separate the football from everything else the football represented. The football war lasted 100 hours. The peace treaty that formally ended it took 10 years to negotiate. That ratio, 100 hours of war, 10 years of peacemaking, says something precise about the relationship between how quickly conflicts begin and how slowly their consequences resolve. The border that both armies crossed in July 1969 was not formally agreed upon until 1980. The underlying issues of land, migration, and economic inequality that had produced the war were never fully resolved at all. They simply found different expressions in different countries. The in the decades that followed. El Salvador's civil war began in 1979. The leftist guerrilla movements that fought the Salvadoran government for 13 years drew heavily from the rural poor, the landless, the displaced, the people whose situation had been worsened rather than resolved by the football war and its aftermath. The 300,000 migrants expelled from Honduras had returned to a country that could not absorb them. Their children grew up in conditions that made political radicalization not an ideology, but a practical response to material reality. 75,000 people died in the Salvadoran Civil War. The international community that had pressured El Salvador to withdraw from Honduras in 1969, that had treated the football war as a bizarre aberration, a conflict too absurd to be real. Watch the Salvadoran Civil War for 13 years without achieving the same rapid resolution. The football war had ended in days because both sides ran out of fuel and the United States applied economic pressure. The Civil War ended only when both sides ran out of something harder to replace. People willing to keep fighting. Honduras stabilized faster, but not without cost. The expulsion of Salvadoran migrants created labor shortages in agricultural regions that had depended on that labor for decades. The land reform that had triggered the expulsions did not deliver the prosperity it had promised. The redistributed land was often less productive than anticipated, and the political support it had been designed to generate was temporary. Honduras spent the 1970s and 1980s as a staging ground for American policy in Central America, a relatively stable country in an unstable region that made it useful to external powers in ways that its own population paid the cost for. The football war had made Honduras briefly the aggrieved party, the invaded nation, the country with international sympathy on its side. That sympathy dissolved quickly once the cameras left. The 1970 World Cup in Mexico is remembered for Brazil. Pelé, Jairzinho, Tostão, Rivellino, the most beautiful football team ever assembled, winning the Jules Rimet Trophy for the third time and keeping it permanently. The tournament that the football war had been fought partly over, producing one of sport's most celebrated moments. El Salvador was there in the group stage, losing every match. The 6,000 dead were not there. They never got to see what the qualification had cost. The football war sits in a specific category of historical events that resist the narratives we normally use to make sense of conflict. It was not a war of ideology. Both governments were conservative, anti-communist, broadly similar in political character. It was not a war of religion or ethnicity. Salvadorans and Hondurans share language, faith, and cultural roots. It was not a war of territorial ambition in the conventional sense. El Salvador wanted its migrants protected, not Honduran land. It was a war of desperation, wearing the costume of nationalism. The football gave both governments and both populations a language for feelings that had no other outlet. The humiliation of poverty, the indignity of expulsion, the anger of displacement. These are not emotions that press conferences and land reform legislation can adequately express. A football match can. And in June and July of 1969, it did. The World Cup has been played every 4 years since 1930. It has never started another war. But the football war is a permanent reminder that sport does not exist outside the world it is played in. That the 90 minutes on the pitch are surrounded by everything the players and the fans carry into the stadium, the history, the grievance, the pride, the desperation that has nowhere else to go. Football did not kill 6,000 people in 1969. The conditions that 6,000 people were already living in did that. The football just made it visible. If this changed how you see the beautiful game, leave a comment. Tell me which part of this story you had never heard. Share this with someone watching the World Cup right now who thinks football is just football. Subscribe for more fascinating stories.